Our first speaker is Doug Hostetter, a Mennonite scholar, writer, and peace activist. He was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War who chose to do his alternative service working for the Mennonite Central Committee in Tam Kỳ, Vietnam, from 1966 to 69. During his time in Vietnam, Doug established a literacy program which used Vietnamese high school students to teach thousands of Vietnamese children whose schools had been destroyed by the US military how to read and write. Doug was a specialist for peace at the United Methodist Office for the United Nations, was the director of the New England Office of the American Friends Service Committee, the director of the US Fellowship of Reconciliation, and directed the Mennonite Central Committee United Nations Office for over a decade. Doug did 2 short-term assignments delivering humanitarian aid, some of which you saw in the slides, to Afghanistan for the Mennonite Central Committee and the American Friends Service Committee in October, November 2001, and July, August of 2002. Doug has published widely on the issues of war, peace, and nonviolence, and is a contributing author to The People Make the Peace, Lessons from the Vietnam Antiwar Movement. Doug?
Thank you, Paul. I should actually correct your introduction a bit. I don't view myself as an academic or a scholar, despite the books behind me. Most of what I've learned has been through 50 years of citizen peace activism and humanitarian aid in various countries around the world. And most of what I've learned is actually from the people rather than from books. I was privileged to actually spend 3 years in Vietnam from 1966 to 1969, doing my alternative service in a small village in central Vietnam, the village of Tam Kỳ. Those are the people who taught me about Vietnam. And 2 things stood it out quite clearly. One was I very quickly was told that the Vietnamese have fought off foreign aggressors for 1,500 years. I remember one of my Vietnamese instructors telling me that at 1,000 years ago, there were 100 tribes of people below the Yangtze River in China. And now, 1,000 years later, there's only one that is independent, and that's Vietnam. And how they had fought China for 1,000 years. They had then fought France for 100 years, and they were now in the middle of a struggle against the Americans. The people who were fighting Americans in Tam Kỳ, and I got to know many people on both sides, the people who were fighting against us were not knowledgeable about Marx, Lenin, or Engels, or Mao Zedong. They were patriots who were fighting for their country against foreigners who had come in and invaded. One of the other things that became very clear as soon as I got to know what was happening in Tam Kỳ is that the government that the Americans had supported in Vietnam was a government that basically we had chosen. And we had chosen basically the Christian minority in Vietnam. Actually, I believe Cardinal Spellman was responsible for finding their first president who was studying in upstate New York. And we thought he would be a good president for Vietnam, for the Americans. It seems that Western nations do not trust people who are not Christian. So many people who wanted to work for the French and later on for the Americans became Christians. And in Tam Kỳ, which was a provincial capital in which the vast majority of the people were farmers and fishermen and Buddhists and Taoists and Confucianists, all of the government leaders were Christian, and they were all from the big cities. None of the local people were at all involved. As a matter of fact, there's a Vietnamese saying that goes Het Gao, lay down, Nui Kong. If you translate that into English, it'd roughly be, if your rice bag is empty, adapt your religion to feed your children. And that's not to say that everybody who became a Christian in Vietnam was an opportunist, but it is to say that any opportunist that wanted to work with the French or the Americans basically had to become Christian. So you had the Americans supporting a basically foreign government that had no link at all to the people in the village where I was working. Perhaps the most articulate description of the Vietnamese situation was from a cab driver in Saigon in 1970 when I was back for a visit. And I will never forget, I wrote it down in my journal immediately afterwards so I wouldn't forget it. And I'll read it to you verbatim. You Americans can come and do what you want. Eventually, you will withdraw, just like the French after 80 years. You can bomb all you want. We will fill up the holes and continue as before. Bring in all the troops you want. Eventually, you will leave and we will still be here. You can bring in all the money you want. You can buy some Vietnamese. You can buy, but you can't buy their hearts. You may be able to buy a Vietnamese woman for a night. You might even be able to get her to marry you. But when you get on the plane and go back to the United States, she won't be on the plane. Whatever you do, eventually you are going to have to leave. And in the end, Vietnam is ours. It was so eloquently stated, and I think the exact same thing would prove true for the Cambodians, for the Afghans as well. I learned from my experience in Vietnam that people respond favorably, even in the middle of the war, if rather than bringing guns and bombs and destructive things, if you bring the things that people actually need. I remember when the World Trade Center was struck, and when very soon thereafter, it became clear to me that the United States was about to attack the poorest country in Asia, a country that was so poor that before the American war started, UNICEF had registered that 70% of the Afghan people were undernourished. It seemed absurd to me, the most powerful nation in the world attacking the poorest country in Asia. I'd worked for both Mennonites and Quakers, and so I contacted the American Friends Service Committee and the Mennonite Central Committee, and I said, you know, the AFSC and MCC should work together and provide Americans for an alternative for how we respond to the Afghan people. You may not be able to determine how your tax dollars use and what the American government does with your tax dollars, but you can actually, we could actually give the American an option. We could take food and blankets to the Afghan people and medicine, things that they actually need. And actually at that point already, it was clear to me that this war was going to be a war against Islam. And I said, if we are going to do this with integrity, we actually have to work with a Muslim organization in this effort. Both AFSC and MCC agreed. They didn't think it would be possible to pull off, but encouraged me to explore. And I soon discovered an amazing Afghan-American woman, Soraya Sadid, who would have been with us were it not for medical situations today. And she had started a small Afghan-American organization called Help the Afghan Children. And already when I contacted her, just a few weeks after September 11th, I learned that she had already organized a material aid delegation that was going to go, she was going to take food to northern Afghanistan. And I asked her, would she welcome the Quakers and the Mennonites to also contribute to purchasing this food? And she said, of course. And I said, would you welcome Mennonites and Quakers joining you? And she said, of course. So I got back in touch with MCC and AFSC, and both of the Asia directors said, well, they were really busy that week, and unfortunately they couldn't do it, but would I represent both organizations? So I was really privileged to have left 7 weeks after September 11th and carried $130,000 in cash to Tajikistan, where we found a supplier who would convert our $130,000 in cash into 19 truckloads of wheat, sugar, and cooking oil in the exact proportions that you need for making Afghan flatbread. We paid them half of the money in Dushanbe in Tajikistan and told them they would get the other half when they brought the food to Afghanistan. And Sarai and I went ahead to prepare things when we were there. It was an amazing experience. In a little over a week, we were able to bring our food together into family packets, and each packet had enough food for making Afghan bread for 7 people for 1 month. And in a few weeks' time, we were able to distribute to 3,600 Afghan families. And the amazing thing was, we were literally a few kilometers away from where the Americans were bombing the Taliban front line. We were kind of on the Northern Alliance side of that line. And all of the people that were in these displaced persons camps were people who had fled their homes because of American bombing. But what I had learned in Vietnam, and what was also true in Afghanistan, if you take people the things that they need and you give it to them with respect and dignity, you will be welcomed and befriended, even by people whose homes have been destroyed by your government bombs. There is an alternative. We could relate differently to Afghanistan. We need to relate differently to Afghanistan now. They still need help, but not in guns and bombs. I thank you.